bubblegum, bazooka zooka bubblegum, bazooka zooka bubblegum, bubblegum, bazooka zooka bubblegum, bazooka zooka bubblegum, bubblegum, bazooka zooka bubblegum, bazooka zooka bubblegum.
Hey, welcome to Half the Battle. As promised, today we're here to get to know the character of Breaker a little better. And, in a nutshell, he's here to kick ass and chew bubblegum.
And unfortunately, he has plenty of bubblegum.
Let's start the fun by looking at the file cards.
Well, I'm afraid to say that his first file card continues the blandness of the first figure. It talks about how he's the communications expert, and he's very efficient. There is some information there that shows the age of the toys, though. He's an expert in all NATO and Warsaw Pact communication devices. Now, for my younger viewers, the Warsaw Pact was the Soviet counterpart to NATO, way back when the Soviet Union existed, and the Russians were douchebags. Well, bigger douchebags anyway. The card also says that Breaker was involved in Project Gamma?
Oh my god! Breaker helped create the Incredible Hulk!
Making him indirectly responsible for Ang Lee's Hulk. That bastard. Well, actually, the real Project Gamma was about covert intelligence operations in Cambodia during the Vietnam War, making Breaker yet another Joe that has his now anachronistic origins set in that conflict. His second file card is where things get strange.
The second file card is from the beloved 1997 line, if you'll recall.
A big part of his text just explains that a radio guy is really important in the field.
I'll just file that one under D for duh.
It also states that Breaker never takes his communication equipment off when in said field. Kind of ironic, considering that, as we've established, the figure itself didn't come with any goddamn radio gear. The file card further states that he was severely injured in a Cobra attack and was in hospital for an extended period of time.
Yeah, I'll come back to that little fact when we get to the comic.
During his recovery, he became a computer expert, since those were becoming more and more important in the military. Even though, according to the comic, he already was a computer expert. Finally, the file card mentions that his only irritating habit is constantly chewing gum and blowing bubbles. It also states that his beard is always sticky from that gum. You remember his beard, right? The one that the figure doesn't actually have?
What wonderful consistency between the toy and the file card. Yeah, at this point I'm amazed they managed to get his gender right.
Later file cards just regurgitate the information from the first two, so there's no point in me going into them. All of his cards do have one weird anomaly though. They all refer to him as the communications officer, even though Breaker was never ever an officer. So now we come to the comics. The first thing to note is that Breaker is actually clean-shaven in the comics, unlike his toy. I have no clue why this change was made. I can only speculate that early toy designs for Breaker had him beardless, so they went with that and stuck with it. The only exception is the Order of Battle comic, which really just reprints the file card information, where the picture of Breaker does have a beard.
Since my comic reviews are already up to issue 15...
Already?
Fine. Since my comic issues are already up to issue 15, you've already seen a lot of what Breaker has done.
It should come as no surprise that we see Breaker the most in the first 2 years of the comic, since there were relatively few characters then. In those early issues, we learn that he's a whiz with communications technology, no duh, and he's a computer engineering expert. He's more or less the go-to tech guy.
His most defining characteristic in the comic is he blows bubblegum. A lot. Really a lot.
It even went so far that the 2008 version of the toy actually came with a little piece of plastic that was supposed to be a bubblegum bubble. Yeah, if there's a panel with Breaker, there's a 50% chance he's drawn in the middle of blowing a bubble. The other 50% he's either just chewing, or you can assume that he's got a piece in his mouth. And since MacGyver has taught you that you can do anything with a clothespin, a rubber band, and a piece of gum, it should come as no surprise that his habit became a plot point on several occasions. In issue 5, for example, him popping a bubble is what fools Cobra, so they believe the unarmed tank Breaker's in is actually packing live ammo, so they surrender. Yes, Breaker saves the day on several occasions by blowing a bubble.
It's strangely charming, actually.
In the interest of honesty, I feel it's worth mentioning that Breaker is responsible for all the crap that happens to the Joes over the next 12 years. You see, at the end of the first issue, they've captured Cobra Commander and the Baroness. Breaker was supposed to watch them, but he turns his goddamn back on them and they promptly escape.
You had one job, Breaker. One job.
So yeah, the whole comic series could have ended right there if it wasn't for Breaker. And unfortunately, he'd pay for that mistake. We learn why in issue 109, Death in the Desert.
Yeah, that title doesn't bode well, does it?
You see, Breaker is another one of the rare characters that died in the comics. He and several other Joes were killed when the vehicle they were on was hit and exploded. Quite a few of the deaths came as a shock to fans, but Breaker's demise probably hit the hardest, as he was the longest-serving member of the Joe team to be killed. His death occurred in the fictional Middle Eastern state of Trucial Abyssmia. The name of the country can be viewed in two ways. The first one is obvious, Abyssmia being a play on the word abysmal, to get the sorry state of the nation across. However, considering the amount of Joes killed there, including one way before issue 109, it's also likely a play on Abyssinia, a former name for Ethiopia, and a term made famous by the TV series MASH. In the series, Commanding Officer Henry Blake often used the term to say goodbye, as you can pronounce it to sound a bit like "I'll be seeing ya." In fact, the episode where Blake is tragically killed is called Abyssinia Henry. Considering Larry Hama, the comic's main writer, has himself appeared on an episode of MASH, it's not too far of a stretch to assume Abyssmia is an homage to that. Especially since you could, with some cheating I'd admit, pronounce Abyssmia as "I'll be missing ya." So yeah, Breaker died in the comic.
But don't worry, he got better. I guess.
Yeah, here's where we go back to the file card from 1997, where it states that he was severely injured, not dead, so they could include him in the set.
So, brief recap.
Breaker from 1997 doesn't look a thing like the original, doesn't have any communications gear, and is supposed to be dead. They got absolutely nothing right with this guy. I'm beginning to think that it's really Zartan in disguise while having an off day.
Look, I'm gonna have to once again clear my palate a bit, so let's talk about the cartoon version of Breaker.
Breaker was introduced in the first GIJoe miniseries, The Mass Device. It's also where he has his biggest part, though that isn't saying much. You see, even when the first miniseries was made, Hasbro was already phasing out the characters from the original GIJoe team, with the exception of Scarlet and Golden Boy Snake Eyes. That's why the story focuses on Duke, and to a lesser extent on newer characters like Gung-Ho, Snowjob, and Torpedo. So, Breaker was featured, but in no way in a starring role. He's seen at the computers and doing communication stuff mostly, while showing up in the background in other locations every now and then. He's basically Uhura, only far less attractive. But hey, at least he has his beard in this version. He was relegated to the background even more as the cartoon series went on, and there was a truly baffling reason for this early on. We know from the comic that Breaker was also a computer expert. In the cartoon, however, they invented a brand new character to basically do Breaker's job, Sparks. Sparks became the computer guy, even though they had Breaker right there. I just don't get it. Later on, the cartoon got dial tone and mainframe, so sadly, there was basically no need for Breaker at all.
In conclusion, Breaker was a great and entertaining character in the comics, but he was sadly underused in the cartoon. And he may or may not be dead.
Well, that just leaves the live-action movie. Here, Breaker is a completely different character, and also French.
What? Oh, you're expecting me to make some stereotypical French jokes now? Well, I'm not gonna do that. You know why? Because the movie didn't do it either! And besides, France is like right next door, and they know where I live.
But seriously, the movie didn't make Breaker, who's a French Moroccan to be precise, into a stereotype. And they didn't have the other characters making fun of him either. No surrender jokes, no baguettes, nothing. Kudos! Especially since GIJoe doesn't have the most awesome track record when it comes to stereotypes. It's probably because the movie isn't called Michael Bay Presents The Rise of Cobra. Otherwise, who knows how it would have turned out. Movie Breaker was competent and fun, and it's a shame that he was absent from the sequel. And he also wasn't a Wayans brother, always a plus. The only thing I'll say about the toy of Movie Breaker is that, to me, he bears a striking resemblance to that guy with the glasses contributor and alleged French person, Sad Panda. Nobody else sees that? I mean, look at him.
Well, that about wraps up Breaker. A pretty cool character all round. See you next week, everybody.
Bubblegum, bazooka, zooka, bubblegum, bazooka, zooka, bubblegum, bubblegum, bazooka, zooka, bubblegum, bazooka, zooka, bubblegum, bubblegum, bazooka, zooka, bubblegum, bazooka, zooka, bubblegum. My mom's, she gave me a nickel. She told me to buy a pickle, but I ain't buy no pickle. I bought some bubblegum, bazooka, zooka, bubblegum.